Everyone abandoned the bankrupt, paralyzed millionaire. His fiancée disappeared. His brother disowned him. The world left him for dead. But one nurse stayed. She saw what no one else did and uncovered a secret buried beneath the scandal. Why did she risk everything for him? And what happens when the truth finally comes out? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The Los Angeles skyline glittered like scattered diamonds against the night sky. Inside the Grand Plaza Hotel's opulent ballroom, camera flashes exploded like miniature supernovas, illuminating Beckett Walsh's confident smile. At 34, he commanded attention without effort. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored black tuxedo, with dark hair and striking green eyes that seemed to catch every light in the room. The air hummed with excitement and the subtle scent of expensive cologne and champagne. "Mr. Walsh, over here," reporters called out. "Just one more shot. Give us that $1,000,000 smile." Beckett obliged with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. His hand rested casually in his pocket, his other arm linked with Camilla Saint, James, his fiancée. She was a vision in a silver designer gown that caught the light with every graceful movement, but her perfectly made-up face was illuminated by the harsh blue light of her phone screen, creating an eerie contrast against the warm glow of the ballroom. The stock dropped another 8%. Camilla hissed through her smile, her fingers frantically scrolling through the financial news. The media is having a field day with those rumors about Novagen's finances. Twitter is blowing up with speculation. Beckett's jaw tightened, but his public smile never wavered. The muscles in his face ached from the effort. "Not now, Cam." "Then when?" She pulled away slightly, her voice sharp but quiet enough that only he could hear. "You keep saying that, but something's wrong. I know it is. Grant called me earlier." "Grant called you?" Beckett's smile finally cracked, his eyes narrowing. "Why is my CFO calling my fiancée behind my back? What did he want?" The tension between them built as they made their way through the crowd, accepting congratulations for Novagen's latest product launch with practiced grace. Hands reached out to pat Beckett's back. Business cards were pressed into his palm. But beneath the surface, Beckett felt like he was drowning in questions he couldn't answer, struggling to keep his head above water. Finally, they escaped to their waiting limousine. As soon as the door closed with a soft thud, shutting out the chaos of reporters and flashing cameras, Camilla turned on him, the pretense of harmony vanishing instantly. "You're hiding something," she said, her blue eyes fierce in the dim interior light. "The press is talking about financial irregularities, missing funds, millions of dollars unaccounted for in the quarterly reports." "They're just rumors," Beckett snapped, loosening his bow tie with an irritated tug. "You know how these tech journalists are. They're desperate for any scandal they can find. They want to see me fall." "Then why won't you look at me when you say that?" Camilla's voice cracked, betraying the emotion behind her perfect exterior. "Why has Grant been acting so strange? Why won't you tell me what's really going on? We're supposed to be getting married in 3 months, Beckett." The limo crawled through downtown traffic, red taillights stretching ahead like a river of rubies. Beckett's chest felt tight, like his perfectly tailored shirt was suddenly 2 sizes too small. The questions he'd been avoiding for weeks pressed in on him from all sides, threatening to crush him. "Stop the car," he ordered suddenly, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "What? Beckett, don't—" But he was already opening the door, cool night air rushing in. "I need some air. I'll see you at home." He stepped out onto the street, ignoring Camilla's protests that echoed behind him. His Ferrari was parked nearby. He always kept it close just in case he needed a quick escape. The cherry red paint gleamed under the streetlights like spilled blood as he slid behind the wheel, the leather seat welcoming him like an old friend. As he roared up Mulholland Drive, the engine purring beneath him, his mind raced faster than the car. Grant's strange behavior these past few months. The missing numbers that didn't add up, no matter how many times he checked. The way his trusted friend and CFO avoided his eyes during meetings, always finding something else to look at. Everything's fine, Grant had assured him just yesterday, clapping him on the shoulder with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. You're paranoid, Beck. Trust me. Have I ever steered you wrong? We're about to close the biggest deal of our lives. The memory of Grant's words mixed with Camilla's accusations, creating a tornado of doubt in his mind. The steering wheel felt slick under his palms as cold sweat broke out across his skin. The road ahead blurred, the yellow lines merging into one continuous streak. Had he been blind? Had he trusted too easily? Had everything he'd built been a lie, a house of cards ready to collapse? Suddenly, bright lights flooded his windshield, blinding him. A horn blared, long and desperate. Beckett jerked the wheel, but it was too late. The world spun in a kaleidoscope of headlights and guardrails. The screech of tires against asphalt pierced the night like a wounded animal. Glass shattered, metal crunched. His body lurched forward against the restraint of his seatbelt. Then darkness swallowed him whole. Beeping. That was the first thing he noticed. Steady, electronic beeping that matched the throbbing in his head. His eyelids felt heavy, like they were weighted down with lead, but he forced them open. White ceiling with water stains. The sharp smell of antiseptic that burned his nostrils. An IV drip swayed gently beside him, the clear liquid traveling down the tube and into his arm. He tried to move, to speak, to call for help. Nothing happened. His body refused to obey the simplest commands. Panic clawed at his chest, squeezing his lungs, but he couldn't even scream. He was a prisoner in his own flesh. Footsteps approached, measured and deliberate. A familiar face appeared above him, his brother Christian, looking more severe than ever in his perfectly pressed gray suit. But instead of concern, Beckett saw cold judgment in his older brother's eyes, a look he'd grown familiar with since childhood. "You really did it this time, little brother," Christian said, his voice flat as a frozen pond. "The feds are investigating Novagen for massive fraud. Your assets are frozen. You're being sued by just about everyone. Shareholders, partners, even charities you donated to." Beckett tried to protest, to ask questions, to defend himself, but his body remained stubbornly still. Only his eyes could move, desperately seeking answers in his brother's face, pleading for understanding. "Oh, and Camilla's gone," Christian added, checking his expensive watch with an air of impatience. "Packed her bags and disappeared. Smart girl. The media's having a field day with all of it. Tech mogul's empire crumbles. That's just one of the kinder headlines. Others are calling for jail time." Tears burned in Beckett's eyes, the only movement his body would allow. They slid down his temples and into his hair. Christian looked at him one last time, his expression a mix of disappointment and resignation, the same look he'd given Beckett since they were boys. "I have to go. I'll have my assistant send over some paperwork for power of attorney." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "You know, I always wondered when it would all catch up to you. I just never thought it would end quite like this. Dad would be devastated." 2 days passed in a blur of doctors, tests, and crushing silence. Nurses came and went, adjusting his position, checking his vitals, speaking about him as if he wasn't there. Then they moved him. The ambulance ride to Silver Pines Rehabilitation Center felt like floating in a nightmare. Beckett watched the ceiling lights stream past above him, each one marking another step away from his old life, from everything he'd built and lost. The rehab center was nothing like the luxury he was used to. His room had beige walls with peeling paint, a window with a view of nothing but a brick wall, and the constant maddening beep of medical equipment. The sheets were rough against his skin, nothing like the Egyptian cotton he slept on at home. As the staff wheeled him in and settled him, speaking in hushed, professional tones, Beckett stared at the wall, trapped in a body that wouldn't move, and a life that had shattered as completely as his windshield on Mulholland Drive. In the silence of his mind, he screamed. Sunlight filtered through the half-drawn blinds as Lucia Delgado walked into room 237. Her white sneakers made soft squeaks against the linoleum floor. She moved with purpose, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her scrubs crisp and clean. The morning shift had just begun, and Beckett Walsh was her first patient of the day. The air in the room felt stale, heavy with the scent of antiseptic and unspoken despair. She picked up his chart from the holder by the door, scanning it quickly. The medical details were stark: partial paralysis, trauma-induced mutism, multiple contusions. But it was what wasn't written that caught her attention. The empty spaces where family contacts should be, the lack of visitor notifications. No flowers adorned his bedside table, no get-well card stood propped against the lamp. "Good morning, Mr. Walsh," she said clearly, looking directly at him. "I'm Lucia Delgado, and I'll be your primary nurse during your stay here." Her voice was firm but gentle, a tone she'd perfected over years of caring for patients who'd rather be anywhere else. Beckett lay still, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The only movement was the steady rise and fall of his chest and the occasional blink. His once handsome face was marred by a fading bruise along his jawline, his complexion pale from weeks indoors. "I know you can hear me," she continued, setting down the chart. "And I know you understand everything I'm saying. I'm not here to pity you. I'm here to help. Blink if you understand." She watched him carefully, noting the slight tightening around his eyes, a reaction however small. No response, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. His stillness was deliberate, a wall built brick by brick. Lucia nodded, unsurprised. "That's fine. We'll work on communication later." She moved to check his vitals, her movements efficient and professional. "I'm going to take your blood pressure now." She'd dealt with stubborn patients before. Resistance was often their only remaining form of control. As she wrapped the cuff around his arm, she noticed his jaw tighten slightly. His eyes remained stubbornly fixed upward, but there was tension in every line of his body. His forearm was still muscular, a reminder of the active life he'd led before the accident. Throughout the morning, Lucia went through the routine of care. She adjusted his position to prevent bed sores, checked his IV lines, and prepared for his morning hygiene routine. Each touch was met with subtle resistance, a slight muscle twitch, a turn of the head, a clenched fist. His body language spoke volumes that his voice couldn't. "Time for your bath," she announced, gathering the necessary supplies. As she began washing his face, he jerked his head away. Lucia paused, then continued calmly. "I understand this is difficult, Mr. Walsh, but fighting it only makes things harder for both of us." She kept her voice matter-of-fact, refusing to coddle or scold. The bath continued in tense silence. As she worked, Lucia's mind drifted to another patient she'd had last year, another proud man brought low by circumstance. And before that, there had been Marco. Her ex-fiancé had taught her plenty about male pride and the walls people built around their pain. She recognized the same defensive patterns in Beckett's resistance. Later that day, while updating patient records at the nurse's station, snippets of conversation floated around her. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as fingers clicked rapidly across keyboards. "Did you see the news?" whispered Nancy, one of the night nurses. "They're saying he knew about the fraud all along. Millions of dollars, just gone." Her voice carried a hint of satisfaction, the kind that comes from seeing the mighty fall. "Rich people," Marco scoffed from behind her. Her ex worked the same floor, making their interactions unavoidable. "They think they can get away with anything." He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his wedding band catching the light, a reminder of how quickly he'd moved on. Lucia kept her eyes on her work, saying nothing. During her break, she pulled out her phone and found herself scrolling through articles about Beckett Walsh. Photos showed him at various events, always impeccably dressed, always smiling. But there was something in his eyes that made her pause. A guardedness, perhaps, or something deeper. Behind the confident smile lurked a vulnerability that the cameras had accidentally captured. The next day brought more resistance. During respiratory therapy, Beckett refused to follow breathing exercises. When she tried to help him with range of motion exercises, his muscles went rigid beneath her touch, like steel cables pulled taut. "Mr. Walsh," she said firmly, "this isn't helping your recovery." She held his gaze, refusing to look away first. "Your body needs movement to heal properly." His only response was to close his eyes, shutting her out completely. Long dark lashes rested against his cheeks, his expression a mask of indifference. The staff's attitude had shifted noticeably. Where there had been professional concern, there was now barely concealed disdain. Nurses took longer to respond to his call button. Even Dr. Patel's rounds seemed shorter, more perfunctory. Whispers followed Beckett like shadows. Judgment passed in glances and shrugs. On the third day, Lucia arrived to find Beckett already awake, staring at the wall. Sunlight caught in his disheveled hair, revealing strands of premature gray at his temples. As she adjusted his IV, his arm jerked, the first real reactive movement she'd seen from him. The sudden motion caused the IV stand to rattle slightly. She finished his morning care in silence, noting how he seemed to retreat further into himself with each passing moment. After completing his sponge bath and grooming, she leaned over him, meeting his eyes directly. The blue of his irises was startling against the redness that rimmed them. "You want me to treat you like a corpse? Fine. Blink twice. Otherwise, you're getting up today." Her challenge hung in the air between them, a gauntlet thrown down. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, deliberately, Beckett blinked. Once, then again. His decision made, his surrender complete. Lucia straightened up and gave him a sharp nod. "Good. Then we start tomorrow." She gathered her supplies, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. It wasn't much, but it was communication. The first crack in his wall of silence. Lucia walked into room 237 with purpose, carrying a clipboard and a laminated chart. The morning light cast long shadows across the floor, and Beckett's eyes followed her movement. She noticed the change immediately. His gaze was sharper, more present than it had been in days. There was an alertness there that had been missing since his admission. "Good morning, Mr. Walsh," she said, pulling up a chair next to his bed. "Today we're going to try something different." She held up the communication chart where he could see it. The letters were large and clear, with simple instructions at the top. The laminated surface caught the sunlight, reflecting tiny prisms onto the wall. "Here's how it works," Lucia explained, her voice steady and professional, but with a warmth that softened the clinical setting. "1 blink for yes, 2 blinks for no. Simple enough, right? We'll start slow and see how it goes." Beckett's eyes fixed on the chart, then moved to her face. His gaze was intense, searching. After a moment, he blinked once, deliberately. "Perfect," she said, settling into her chair with a small nod of encouragement. "Let's start with the basics. Are you in pain right now? Don't try to be brave. I need honest answers." 2 slow blinks. "Are you thirsty? Would you like some water?" She leaned forward slightly, watching his response carefully. 1 blink. Lucia reached for the water cup with its bent straw, holding it carefully to his lips. "Small sips," she reminded him gently. "We don't want to overwhelm your system." As he drank, she noticed his shoulders relaxing slightly, the tension easing from his jaw. They fell into a rhythm over the next few hours. Lucia moved through her regular care routine, but now she narrated everything, asking permission with yes or no questions. The simple act of giving him choices seemed to make a difference. "I'm going to check your blood pressure now, okay?" 1 blink. "Ready to turn onto your side?" 2 blinks. He needed a minute. She waited patiently, giving him the time he needed. Around noon, as she adjusted his pillows, Lucia's straight face cracked slightly. "I must be driving you crazy with all these questions, huh? Am I annoying you yet?" Her tone was lighter, testing the waters of a more personal connection. One quick blink, followed by something new. A slight crinkle around his eyes that might have been amusement. It was the first hint of personality breaking through his mask of stoicism. "Oh, so I am annoying?" Lucia raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching upward. "Well, at least you're honest. I can respect that." 2 blinks this time, faster, almost playful. His eyes seemed to hold a message his voice couldn't yet express. As the afternoon wore on, Lucia began asking different kinds of questions. She sat beside him during his lunch break, keeping him company while he ate through the feeding tube. The mechanical process seemed less clinical with her there, talking softly. "Are you scared?" she asked quietly, watching his face. The question hung in the air between them, more intimate than anything she'd asked before. The silence stretched. Finally, one slow, reluctant blink. His eyes dropped momentarily, as if admitting this vulnerability cost him something. "That's okay," she said simply, without pity or condescension. "Fear is normal. Anyone would be scared in your situation. Do you hate it when we have to move you?" Another long pause. One blink. "I understand." Lucia nodded, her expression thoughtful. Touch can feel invasive when you're not in control. It's one of the hardest parts for many patients. "Would it help if I always tell you exactly what I'm going to do before I do it?" One blink, quicker this time. The relief in his eyes was unmistakable. The evening brought a different energy to the room. The halls outside grew quieter, and the harsh fluorescent lights gave way to softer lamplight. Lucia moved around the room, straightening things, checking equipment with practiced efficiency. The silence felt heavy, but not uncomfortable anymore. She pulled out her phone and pulled up a playlist. "Mind if I play some music while I work? Sometimes the hospital gets too quiet at night." One blink. Soft jazz filled the room. Miles Davis, gentle and smooth. The notes seemed to float through the sterile air, transforming the space. Lucia hummed along as she worked, noticing how Beckett's breathing seemed to sync with the rhythm. His eyes followed her as she moved around the room, but there was less tension in his face now. The furrow between his brows had eased. She changed his sheets with practiced efficiency, speaking to him casually about nothing in particular. The weather, the news, carefully avoiding any mention of tech companies or scandals. A funny thing her neighbor's cat had done that morning. It wasn't the usual one-sided monologue of a nurse to a silent patient. There was dialogue now, even if one participant could only communicate through blinks. She paused occasionally, giving him space to respond. The janitor came by, nodding to Lucia as he quickly mopped the floor. The day nurse stopped in to do a final check of Beckett's vitals. Through it all, Lucia maintained their bubble of calm, the jazz providing a gentle soundtrack that seemed to insulate them from the hospital's clinical atmosphere. As she finished organizing his bedside table, a new song came on, an old Coltrane piece with its mournful saxophone. Lucia paused in her work, her hands going still. "Do you like this music?" she asked softly, turning to face him fully. 2 deliberate blinks. There was something almost defiant in his response. A smile spread across her face, the first real one she'd shown him, reaching all the way to her eyes. "You've got taste, Mr. Walsh. I wouldn't have pegged you as a jazz critic." His eyes held hers for a moment, and something passed between them. Understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. The music played on, filling the comfortable silence between them, saying what words and blinks couldn't yet express. Lucia adjusted Beckett's 4th line, noting how his eyes followed her every movement with an intensity that made her skin prickle. When she accidentally knocked over an empty plastic cup, sending it clattering across the bedside table, he blinked rapidly and rolled his eyes with such exaggerated flair that it was practically theatrical. "You always this dramatic?" she asked, fighting back a smile that tugged at the corners of her mouth. One deliberate blink, slow and purposeful. "Figures," she snorted, shaking her head as she retrieved the fallen cup. "Let me guess. You were probably the type who made everything into a production in high school theater. Center stage, spotlight, and all." Two rapid blinks, his expression mock-offended, eyebrows shooting up toward his hairline. "No? Business presentations, then?" One blink, accompanied by what could almost be called a smirk in his eyes, a gleam of satisfaction. "Ah, there it is. Bet you had everyone eating out of your hand during board meetings? The great Beckett Walsh, tech mogul extraordinaire." As she checked his vitals, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around his arm with practiced ease, their newfound rhythm continued. Blink by blink, gesture by gesture, she was seeing more of the man beneath the silence. His personality leaked through in small ways. An eye roll here, a raised eyebrow there, the occasional twitch of his mouth. It wasn't quite conversation, but it was something tangible, a bridge forming between them. A knock at the door interrupted their exchange. A young courier stood there, shifting nervously from foot to foot, holding a padded manila envelope. "Delivery for Mr. Walsh?" he said, consulting his clipboard with uncertain eyes. "From his former assistant? They said it was important." "I'll sign for it," Lucia said, accepting the package and scribbling her signature on the electronic pad. After the courier left, his footsteps fading down the hallway, she opened the envelope and pulled out a sleek tablet in a buttery leather case. "Look what we have here," she murmured, showing it to Beckett, turning it over in her hands. His eyes widened slightly, recognition clear on his face, a spark igniting behind the usual guardedness. "Want me to plug it in?" One firm blink, unmistakable in its urgency. Lucia found a charging cord in the drawer and connected the tablet, the small charging light blinking to life. While it powered up, she continued her routine checks: temperature, oxygen levels, wound dressing. But her curiosity kept drawing her attention back to the device like a magnet. When the screen finally lit up with a soft blue glow, she hesitated, suddenly aware of the intimacy of accessing someone else's digital life. "Would you like me to?" She gestured at the tablet, unsure how to proceed. Another clear blink, his gaze intense and unwavering. The home screen appeared, filled with neatly organized folders and icons. Documents, emails, spreadsheets, fragments of Beckett's former life, all contained in this single device. Lucia sat in the chair beside his bed, the vinyl creaking beneath her, angling the screen so he could see it too, their shoulders almost touching. As she navigated through the files, her fingertips sliding across the glass, something caught her eye. A folder labeled Financial Records 2023, tucked between quarterly reports. She opened it, finding transaction logs and banking statements arranged in meticulous order. At first glance, the numbers seemed ordinary enough, rows of figures and dates. But as she looked closer, squinting slightly, discrepancies began to emerge like shadows lengthening at sunset. Large sums moving between accounts at odd hours, timestamps that didn't align with meeting minutes, and signatures, digital ones, that looked slightly different from file to file, with subtle variations in the loops and curves. She pulled up another document for comparison, and her breath caught in her throat. The signatures didn't match, the differences small, but unmistakable to her careful eye. Lucia glanced at Beckett, but his expression had gone blank, unreadable, a mask sliding into place. She continued scrolling, her heart beating faster against her ribs as more irregularities appeared like red flags. One name kept showing up in the metadata of the altered documents: Grant Kellman, CFO. "I need to print something," she said quietly, standing up and smoothing her scrubs with suddenly clammy hands. "I'll be right back. Don't go anywhere." The weak joke fell flat in the heavy silence. In the staff lounge, Nurse Tanya looked up from her coffee as Lucia entered, the fluorescent lights harsh after the dimness of Beckett's room. "You okay?" You look like you've seen a ghost, all pale and shaky." "Just tired," Lucia replied, connecting to the printer with fumbling fingers. Her hand shook slightly as she selected the files, hoping Tanya wouldn't notice her agitation. The printer hummed to life, spitting out page after page of what she now recognized as damning evidence. As she gathered the warm papers, the smell of toner sharp in her nostrils, her mind raced down dangerous paths. Everything she'd heard about Beckett, the fraud allegations plastered across news sites, the scandal that had rocked the tech world, the frozen assets that had crippled his company. It all looked different now, refracted through a new lens. The numbers told a different story. The signatures told a different story. The truth was hidden in plain sight, encoded in digital timestamps and account transfers. Standing alone in the dimly lit lounge, Lucia stared at the final page, the paper trembling slightly in her grip. The forged signature seemed to mock her with its careful deception. "You didn't do it, did you?" she whispered to herself, the words barely audible over the hum of the vending machine. The weight of her discovery settled over her like a heavy blanket, smothering and inescapable. She was no longer just a nurse caring for a difficult patient. She had stumbled onto something bigger, something dangerous, a conspiracy that had destroyed a man's life and reputation. And now she had to decide what to do about it, what risks she was willing to take. Looking down at the papers in her trembling hands, Lucia realized she was afraid, not of Beckett, with his eye rolls and silent communication, but for him, and for herself. Because she was suddenly very sure she was in too deep, wading into waters where powerful people had already proven they would do anything to protect themselves. Lucia's heels clicked against the polished hospital floor as she made her way to Dr. Patel's office. The manila folder containing the printed documents felt heavy in her hands, like a weight of responsibility she wasn't sure she should bear. She'd rehearsed what she would say a dozen times during her morning commute, mentally practicing each word, but her heart still raced beneath her scrubs. Dr. Patel sat behind his mahogany desk, barely glancing up from his computer screen when she knocked. His fingers continued typing, as if her presence was merely an interruption. "Come in, Nurse Delgado." "Dr. Patel, I need to discuss something important about Beckett Walsh's case." Lucia's voice was steady despite her nerves. She squared her shoulders, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. He finally looked up, his expression neutral behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "Yes?" Lucia opened the folder and laid out the documents, spreading them carefully across his desk. "I found these transaction records on Mr. Walsh's tablet. The signatures don't match his other documents, and the numbers. They don't add up. Look at these discrepancies." "Stop right there." Dr. Patel's voice turned cold, ice forming around each syllable. "Where did you get these?" "His tablet was delivered yesterday with his personal effects. I was checking to make sure everything worked properly when I noticed." "You were snooping through a patient's personal property?" His eyes narrowed, disapproval radiating from him in waves. "That's completely inappropriate, Nurse Delgado. Unethical even." "But sir, these documents show clear evidence of—" "They show nothing except that you're overstepping your boundaries." He stood up, straightening his white coat with a sharp tug. "Your job is to provide care for your patients, not play detective. Stay in your lane, Nurse Delgado. This is your only warning." Lucia's cheeks burned hot with embarrassment and frustration. "With all due respect, Dr. Patel, I think someone should look into this. That will be all, Nurse Delgado." He gathered the papers and handed them back to her dismissively, making it clear the conversation was over. Dejected, but not defeated, Lucia clutched the folder to her chest and headed to the nurse's station where Nurse Tanya was reviewing charts, her reading glasses reflecting the fluorescent lights above. Maybe another perspective would help, someone who'd listen to reason. "Tanya, do you have a minute? I could really use your advice." The older nurse looked up, her reading glasses perched on her nose, crow's feet crinkling at the corners of her eyes. "What's troubling you, dear? You look like you've seen a ghost, Lucia explained her findings in hushed tones, watching Tanya's expression grow increasingly concerned. Not about the evidence, but about Lucia herself. The worry lines on Tanya's forehead deepened with each word. "Honey," Tanya said softly, placing a weathered hand over Lucia's. "I've been here 20 years. I've seen nurses get too invested in patients before. They cross lines, blur boundaries. It never ends well. Never. This isn't about being invested. It's about the truth. Someone is framing him." "The truth?" Tanya's voice dropped to a whisper, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "People have been talking, Lucia. They see how much time you spend with him, how personal it's getting. The way you light up when you enter his room." "I'm doing my job," Lucia insisted, pulling her hand away. "Are you?" Tanya's eyes were kind but firm, filled with maternal concern. "Because from where I stand, you're getting emotionally involved with a man accused of stealing millions, a man who might be manipulating your good heart." A shadow fell across the desk, cutting through their conversation. Marco stood there, his dark eyes fixed on Lucia, his security badge hanging from his neck. "Can we talk? Privately?" Lucia followed her ex down the hallway to the empty break room, tension building with each step. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry bees as he closed the door behind them with a soft click. "What are you doing, Lucia?" His voice was low, concerned, with an edge of possessiveness that made her bristle. "Not this again, Marco. I don't need another lecture. You're different around him. I see how you look at him, how much time you spend in his room, the way you defend him to everyone." He ran a hand through his dark hair. "It's not professional. He needs help, real help, not just medical care. He needs a nurse, not a savior." Marco stepped closer, the scent of his familiar cologne bringing unwanted memories. "Remember what happened last time you tried to fix someone? How that turned out for both of us?" The words stung like alcohol on an open wound. Their breakup was still a fresh wound, barely scabbed over. "This isn't about us. It never was. No, it's about you getting wrapped up in something dangerous. That man is under federal investigation. People like him don't end up here by accident." "You don't know him," she said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "Neither do you." Marco's voice rose slightly, frustration evident in his clenched jaw. "Stop before you get hurt, before your career gets hurt. Please, Lucia." Lucia pushed past him, her hands shaking as she gripped the folder. She needed air, needed to think, needed to be anywhere but trapped in that tiny room with her past and present colliding. When she returned to Beckett's room for his afternoon checkup, his eyes locked onto her immediately from his hospital bed. He could sense something was wrong. She'd never been good at hiding her emotions. His gaze was intense, questioning, more alert than she'd seen before. "Everyone thinks I'm crazy," she muttered, checking his vitals and adjusting his IV line. "Maybe I am. Maybe I'm seeing things that aren't there." Beckett blinked rapidly, urgently, his eyes wide with meaning. "What is it? Are you in pain?" More rapid blinking. His eyes darted toward the door, then back to her, then to the ceiling camera in the corner. The message was clear even without words. "Be careful. Don't trust them. You're being watched." Lucia's throat tightened with sudden understanding. She nodded slightly, the smallest acknowledgement possible. "I understand." The rest of her shift passed in a blur of sideways glances and whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Colleagues who normally greeted her warmly now offered tight smiles or avoided eye contact altogether. She felt like an outsider in a place that had been her second home for years, a stranger among friends. That evening, after most of the staff had gone home and the hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm, Lucia slipped back into Beckett's room. The night shift nurse wouldn't do rounds for another hour, giving them precious time alone. She pulled the damning documents from her bag and sat in the chair beside his bed, the plastic squeaking under her weight. The room was quiet, except for the steady beep of monitors and their soft breathing in the dimmed light. "I believe you, Beckett." Her whisper seemed to fill the darkness hanging in the air between them. She reached out and took his hand, surprising herself with the gesture. His skin was warm against her palm, his fingers twitching slightly at her touch as if trying to respond. In the dim light, she stared at the papers that had caused so much trouble, spread across her lap like pieces of a puzzle. The forged signature seemed to mock her, but it also strengthened her resolve. Something wasn't right in this whole situation, and she wouldn't back down until she discovered what it was, no matter what it cost her. Beckett's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around hers, a gentle pressure that spoke volumes. His eyes, reflecting the soft glow of the monitors, held hers with an intensity that took her breath away. In that moment, their connection transcended words, blinking, and all the barriers between them. Patient and nurse, accused and defender, stranger and friend. They were in this together now, for better or worse, bound by truth and trust in a world that seemed determined to keep them apart. Lucia walked into Beckett's room early the next morning, carrying a sleek tablet device in her hands. Her heart fluttered with anticipation as she approached his bed. The morning sunlight filtered through the partially drawn blinds, casting a warm glow across the sterile room. "Good morning," she said, holding up the tablet. "I found something that might help us communicate better." Her voice carried a hint of excitement she couldn't quite hide. Beckett's eyes widened slightly, showing interest. A spark of curiosity replaced the usual frustration in his gaze. Lucia positioned the tablet on a movable stand in front of him and adjusted it to the perfect height, her movements deliberate and careful. "It's an eye-tracking device," she explained, powering it up. The screen illuminated with a simple interface. "You just look at the letters and blink to select them. It might take some practice, but..." The cursor moved across the screen as Beckett's eyes tracked the letters. Slowly, deliberately, words appeared. "Where did you go last night?" The question hung between them, unexpected and direct. Lucia's cheeks flushed. She hadn't expected him to notice her late-night visit. Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her scrub top. I was worried about you." Beckett's eyes moved again. "Checking up on me?" The words appeared faster this time, his control of the device improving by the moment. "Maybe," she smiled, adjusting his pillows with practiced hands. "Someone has to make sure you're not plotting an escape." She tried to keep her tone light, though the memory of his distress last night still troubled her. "Funny." His response appeared quickly now, showing he was already getting comfortable with the device. "Tell me about yourself." Lucia hesitated, then pulled up a chair beside his bed. The vinyl squeaked as she sat down. "What do you want to know?" "Everything." A pause then. "Start with why you became a nurse." She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. His intense gaze made her feel strangely vulnerable. "My mom raised me alone. She worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. When I was 12, she got sick. The nurses who took care of her, they showed me what compassion really means." The memory still felt fresh, even after all these years. Beckett's eyes softened as he typed. "Your mom, is she..." The unfinished question revealed a gentleness she hadn't seen in him before. "She recovered," Lucia assured him quickly, touched by his concern. "She's fine now, but I never forgot those nurses, how they made us feel safe, cared for." She smiled, remembering. "They brought light into our darkest days." Noble. His response appeared with a hint of his usual sarcasm. "But there's more." Lucia shifted in her chair, the plastic creaking beneath her. "There was someone. We were engaged." She twisted her hands in her lap. The phantom weight of a ring still sometimes felt on her finger. He was a doctor. Everything looked perfect on paper, but he wasn't who I thought he was. The pain had dulled over time, but talking about it still made her chest tighten. Men rarely are. Beckett's message carried a self-deprecating tone that surprised her. Present company included? Lucia teased, grateful for the chance to lighten the mood. Especially present company. His eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, the closest thing to a smile he could manage. The small expression transformed his face, making him look younger, more approachable. Throughout the morning, as Lucia went about her usual care routine, they continued talking. She checked his vitals, adjusted his medication, and helped him with gentle range of motion exercises, all while their conversation flowed. Beckett asked about her favorite books, laughing, through text, at her love of romance novels. She defended her choices, and he typed out elaborate critiques that made her laugh despite herself. Pride and Prejudice. His message appeared with multiple question marks. Really? The screen seemed to convey his incredulity perfectly. It's a classic, Lucia protested, changing his IV bag with practiced efficiency. Don't tell me you've never read it. She raised an eyebrow, enjoying their banter more than she should. Tech moguls don't read Jane Austen. The words appeared with what she could only imagine was a hint of smugness. Maybe they should. Might teach them something about pride and prejudice. She raised an eyebrow at him, a challenging smile playing on her lips. His response came quickly. Touché. She could almost hear the dry tone he would have used if he could speak. As the morning wore on, their conversation flowed naturally between casual banter and deeper topics. Beckett asked about her childhood, her dreams, her fears. Lucia found herself opening up more than she had to anyone in years. There was something about his attentive gaze that made her want to share parts of herself she usually kept hidden. What about music? He typed, his eyes moving with increasing confidence across the screen. Classical when I'm working, jazz when I'm relaxing, she answered, organizing his medications in neat rows on the bedside table. And yes, before you ask, I also like pop music. Judge away. She braced herself for the teasing she knew would come. No judgment. Jazz, huh? Play something. The request seemed to soften the space between them. Lucia pulled out her phone and put on a soft jazz melody. The music filled the room, creating an intimate atmosphere that made her pulse quicken slightly. The gentle saxophone notes seemed to transform the clinical space into something more personal. Good taste, he typed, for someone who reads romance novels. The screen couldn't hide the playfulness behind his words. You're impossible, she laughed, but her cheeks felt warm. She busied herself with straightening his blankets, avoiding his gaze. Later, while helping him with lunch, Lucia carefully wiped a drop of water from the corner of his mouth. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. She quickly looked away, her hand trembling slightly as she set down the napkin. The moment felt charged, dangerous. When she glanced back at the tablet screen, his message made her heart skip. You're cute when you're flustered. The words seemed to hover in the air between them. Lucia took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This was dangerous territory. He was her patient, and she was his nurse. Professional boundaries existed for a reason, but something about the way he looked at her made all her carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. I should check on my other patients, she said softly, gathering her things. Her movements were hurried, almost clumsy. His final message of the morning appeared. Come back soon. Simple words that somehow felt like a promise. As Lucia walked out of his room, she pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her racing heart. The cool hallway did nothing to calm the warmth spreading through her. She knew she was falling for Beckett Walsh, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The realization terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Lucia stood beside Beckett's bed during their morning physical therapy session, her hands gently supporting his arm as she guided him through the routine exercises. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting warm stripes across the hospital sheets. The faint sounds of the hospital corridor outside seemed distant, creating a peaceful bubble around them. "Okay, let's try moving your fingers again," she said softly, demonstrating the movement with her own slender fingers. "Just focus on your index finger, like we practiced yesterday. Remember, small steps." Beckett's eyes were intense with concentration, fixed on his right hand. A tiny furrow appeared between his brows as he channeled all his willpower. Lucia watched carefully, holding her breath. They'd been working on this for weeks, with only the smallest signs of progress, moments that kept their hope alive despite the setbacks. Suddenly, his index finger twitched. It wasn't much, just a tiny movement, but it was deliberate and controlled. A breakthrough in the stillness that had imprisoned his body. Lucia gasped, her heart skipping a beat. She took a step back, her hands flying to her mouth, eyes widening. "Beckett, you did it. You really did it." His eyes sparkled with triumph as he focused harder, making the finger twitch again. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him. Tears welled up in Lucia's eyes, blurring her vision, and before she could stop herself, she threw her arms around him in a tight, spontaneous hug, the scent of her floral shampoo mingling with the antiseptic hospital smell. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, quickly pulling back and wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "That was completely unprofessional. I shouldn't have." Beckett's eyes moved to the tablet screen. With careful concentration, he typed, each tap a small victory. "Best reward ever." Lucia laughed through her tears, her cheeks flushing pink. "You're impossible, you know that? One finger movement, and you're already flirting." Over the next few hours, they worked together as Beckett gained more control over his finger. Each successful movement brought a new wave of excitement. By lunchtime, he could tap out simple messages on a modified keyboard Lucia had brought in, his determination evident in the beads of sweat on his forehead. "Wait here," she said, as if he could go anywhere. She gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "I have something for you." She returned carrying a Kindle, already powered on, its screen glowing softly. "I loaded it with some of my favorite books. I thought, well, maybe we could read together sometimes, when you get tired of just staring at me all day." Beckett's finger moved slowly but deliberately. "What kind of books?" "Poetry, classics, some contemporary stuff." She scrolled through the library, her enthusiasm bubbling through. "There's Neruda, Frost, Austen. I tried to include a bit of everything." "Nerd," he typed, but his eyes were soft with affection, crinkling slightly at the corners. Throughout the afternoon, they took turns reading passages to each other. Or rather, Lucia read aloud while Beckett typed his commentary. Her voice filled the sterile room with warmth and color. They argued playfully about interpretations, shared favorite quotes, and discovered they both had a weakness for romantic poetry, though neither would admit it first. The hospital room transformed into their own literary salon. "Listen to this one," Lucia said, reading from Pablo Neruda, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "I love you without knowing how or when or from where. I love you simply, without problems or pride." She trailed off, suddenly aware of how intimate the moment felt. The words hung in the air between them. Beckett was watching her intently, his eyes full of something that made her heart race against her ribs. "Your turn to pick," she said quickly, handing him the Kindle, her fingers brushing against his. As the day went on, Beckett's typing grew stronger, more confident. Each message came faster than the last. He began sharing longer thoughts, asking more personal questions. Lucia found herself opening up about her life, her dreams, her fears, things she'd never told anyone else, secrets she'd kept locked away until now. "Why did you become a nurse?" he typed, the question appearing letter by letter. "I wanted to help people," she answered honestly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "But more than that, I wanted to be there for people when they felt most alone, when they had no voice of their own." "Like you were there for me?" Lucia's breath caught in her throat. The simple question touched something deep within her. "Yes," she whispered. "Like that." The sun was setting when Beckett typed his next message, golden light painting the walls. "Thank you for staying." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. Lucia stood beside his bed, her hand hovering uncertainly over his. Then, following her heart rather than her head, she leaned down and pressed a soft, quick kiss to his forehead, her lips lingering for just a heartbeat. The moment hung in the air between them, delicate and charged with meaning. Lucia straightened up, her cheeks burning. Without meeting his eyes, she gathered her things and walked to the door, her heart pounding in her ears. At the threshold, she paused and looked back. Beckett was watching her, his expression gentle and understanding, something new and unspoken passing between them. She closed the door quietly behind her, her fingertips touching her lips, her heart pounding with the knowledge that something had shifted between them. Something profound that couldn't be undone. Something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. But before Beckett could respond, the door swung open. Marco Alvarez stood in the doorway, his face tight with displeasure. "Lucia, break room. Now." She squeezed Beckett's hand reassuringly before following Marco out. The break room was empty except for them, the fluorescent lights harsh and unforgiving. Marco crossed his arms. "I saw what happened yesterday." "What are you talking about?" Lucia kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "Don't play dumb." The kiss. His jaw clenched. "You crossed a line, Lucia. That's completely inappropriate behavior with a patient." "It wasn't like that," she protested. "I was just what? Getting emotionally involved with a patient? A fraud suspect?" Marco's voice rose. "I've seen how you look at him, how much time you spend in his room, the little jokes, the special attention." Lucia felt her face flush with anger. "I'm doing my job, Marco. He needs support. He needs a nurse, not a girlfriend." Marco stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If you don't back off, I'll have no choice but to report this to administration." "Are you threatening me?" Lucia's hands balled into fists. "I'm warning you, as a colleague, as someone who once cared about you." His eyes narrowed. "Back off, or I'll make sure Dr. Patel knows everything." Before Lucia could respond, Marco stormed out. She stood there, trembling with anger and fear, knowing he meant every word. The next morning, Dr. Patel's secretary called her into his office. Her stomach dropped when she saw Marco standing there, along with Nurse Tanya and a representative from HR. "Ms. Delgado," Dr. Patel began, his voice cold. "Serious allegations have been made about your conduct with patient Beckett Walsh." "This is ridiculous," Lucia protested. "I've done nothing wrong." "Multiple staff members have reported inappropriate behavior," the HR representative cut in. "Until we complete our investigation, you're suspended without pay, effective immediately." The words hit her like a physical blow. "But my patients will be reassigned," Nurse Tanya said firmly. "Please surrender your badge." Lucia's hands shook as she unpinned her ID badge. Through the office window, she could see Beckett's room. He was watching, his eyes wide with concern as security arrived to escort her out. She barely had time to grab her personal belongings. As they led her past Beckett's room, she saw him frantically typing on his communication device. The message flashed on the screen. "Don't let them do this." But she couldn't stop, couldn't fight, couldn't even say goodbye. The security guards flanked her as she walked through the lobby, past whispering nurses and staring patients. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. Outside, the morning sun was blindingly bright. Lucia stood in the parking lot, clutching her bag, feeling like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd built, gone in an instant. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number appeared. "I'm not done fighting. B." Lucia stared at the screen, tears finally spilling over. She'd lost her job, her reputation, and most importantly, she'd lost the ability to help the one person who needed her most. But that message, those 4 simple words, held a promise she desperately wanted to believe in. She sank onto a nearby bench, the world spinning around her. In just 24 hours, her life had completely unraveled. And somewhere inside that building, Beckett was alone again, probably blaming himself for what had happened. The worst part wasn't losing her job. It was knowing that Beckett would be left in the care of people who saw him as nothing more than a burden, a criminal, a problem to be managed. People who didn't see the man behind those expressive eyes, who didn't understand the depth of his struggle, his pain, his fight to reclaim his life. Another message buzzed through. "I'll fight for you." Lucia pressed her phone to her chest, her tears falling freely now. In trying to help Beckett heal, she'd opened her heart in ways she never expected. And now, sitting alone outside the hospital where she'd found her purpose, she realized that sometimes fighting for what's right meant losing everything first. She looked up at the window she knew was his, wondering if he could see her, wondering if he knew that despite everything, despite the suspension, despite Marco's betrayal, despite all she'd lost, she didn't regret a single moment of their time together. Because sometimes, the right thing and the hard thing were exactly the same. Lucia sat across from James Chen, the forensic analyst in his cramped home office. Stacks of papers covered every surface, and 3 computer monitors displayed complex financial data. The afternoon sun filtered through dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the room. "These transactions," James pointed to a spreadsheet, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. "They're definitely suspicious. The timing, the amounts, it all points to systematic fraud. But what's really interesting is this." He pulled up a series of digital signatures. "See how the strokes differ? Someone tried to copy Beckett's signature, but they missed subtle details." Lucia leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Can you prove it wasn't Beckett?" James nodded, clicking through more documents. The metadata tells a story. Every document was modified from Grant Kellman's computer. The timestamps show patterns, late nights, weekends when Beckett wasn't even in the office. They spent hours compiling everything: bank statements, forged signatures, security footage from Nova Gen's offices showing Grant's suspicious behavior. James edited it all into a clear, compelling narrative. "What about Beckett's current condition?" Lucia asked, pulling out her phone. "I have videos showing his communication system, proving he's been trying to tell his side." James added clips of Beckett using his eye-tracking device, his messages revealing his desperate attempts to expose the truth. The final video was powerful. 15 minutes of irrefutable evidence that painted a clear picture of betrayal and fraud. Lucia's hands shook as she watched the finished product. "This is it," she whispered. "This will clear his name." That evening, in her small apartment, Lucia sat cross-legged on her bed with her laptop. Her finger hovered over the upload button. Taking a deep breath, she pressed it. The video began processing on multiple social media platforms. She barely slept that night, checking the view count every few hours. By dawn, it had reached 100,000 views. By noon, over 4 million. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications as the story spread like wildfire. Major news networks picked up the story. Headlines flashed across screens nationwide. "Tech mogul framed," "The truth behind Nova Gen scandal," and "CFO's betrayal, Beckett Walsh innocent." The FBI moved quickly. By evening, footage of Grant Kellman being led away in handcuffs dominated the news. His face was ashen, his designer suit wrinkled as agents escorted him into a waiting car. Christian Walsh appeared on morning television, his usual confidence replaced by visible discomfort. I may have been too quick to judge my brother," he stammered. "In light of new evidence," the host cut him off. "But you abandoned him, your own brother, when he needed you most." Christian had no response. Lucia's phone rang. It was Dr. Patel from Silver Pines. "Miss Delgado, in light of recent developments, we'd like to offer you immediate reinstatement, with a promotion and raise, of course." Lucia's voice was firm. "Thank you, but I'll only return when Beckett is fully exonerated and receives proper care. Not before." She hung up and changed into the red dress she'd bought months ago, but never worn. The silk fabric swished around her legs as she drove to Silver Pines. This time, she didn't use her badge to enter. She signed in as a visitor. The halls felt different now. Staff members who had once whispered behind her back now smiled nervously or looked away. She held her head high as she walked to Beckett's room. He sat in his wheelchair by the window, staring out at the garden. The morning light cast a soft glow on his face, highlighting the shadows under his eyes. When she entered, he turned slowly. Their eyes met. Recognition flickered across his face, not just of her presence, but of everything she'd done, everything they'd been through together. His eyes widened slightly, taking in her red dress, her determined stance. Lucia moved closer, her heels clicking softly on the linoleum floor. She stopped beside his wheelchair, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and shared understanding. His finger twitched on the arm of his wheelchair, and for the first time in days, Beckett's eyes held a spark of hope. The therapy garden at Silver Pines was quiet in the early morning light. Dew sparkled on rose petals and fresh-cut grass, creating a peaceful sanctuary away from the sterile hospital halls. Beckett sat in his wheelchair, his shoulders straighter than they'd been in months. The morning breeze ruffled his dark hair, now neatly trimmed thanks to Lucia's care. Lucia knelt beside him, her red dress pooling around her knees. She didn't care about the dampness seeping into the fabric. Her warm hand found his, and their fingers touched, a simple contact that meant everything. Beckett's eyes, once cold and distant, now held a warmth that made Lucia's heart skip. He looked down at their joined hands, concentration etching lines around his eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his index finger. The movement was small, trembling with effort, but he managed to brush it against the soft skin of Lucia's palm. Tears welled in Lucia's eyes. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The garden around them seemed to hold its breath. A hummingbird paused at a nearby flower, its wings creating a gentle hum that matched the rhythm of their hearts. Beckett's finger continued its gentle exploration, tracing invisible patterns on Lucia's hand. Later that afternoon, Lucia helped Beckett position the speech device on his wheelchair tray. A small group had gathered in the rehab center's conference room, loyal investors who hadn't abandoned him, colleagues who'd stood by him through the scandal, and a few family members who'd finally seen the truth. Christian lingered near the back wall, his usual confidence dimmed by shame and regret. He couldn't quite meet his brother's eyes. Beckett's fingers trembled as he adjusted the device. Lucia stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Her presence gave him strength, grounding him in the moment. The device crackled to life. Beckett's voice emerged through the speaker, mechanical but clear, carrying the weight of everything he'd learned through his ordeal. "Thank you for coming," he began. The words were slow, carefully chosen. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on the man they'd once known as a powerful tech mogul. But the person before them now was different, humbled, yet somehow stronger. "I used to think success meant having the biggest company, the most money, the flashiest car. Beckett paused, his fingers working carefully over the controls. I was wrong. Losing everything taught me how to fight, not with money, but with truth, with love. Lucia squeezed his shoulder gently. She saw several people in the audience dabbing at their eyes. Some of you stood by me when everyone else believed the lies, Beckett continued. Others, his eyes flickered briefly to Christian, are learning that truth matters more than appearances. I'm grateful for both, because this journey has shown me what really matters. The mechanical voice couldn't fully convey the emotion behind the words, but Beckett's eyes spoke volumes. They found Lucia's, and the love there was unmistakable. I'm not the same man who crashed his Ferrari on Mulholland Drive. That man was running from himself. This man, he gestured to himself with a slightly shaky hand, is learning to stand still, to reach out, to trust. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the courtyard windows, Beckett and Lucia found themselves alone again. The day's emotions had left them both drained but peaceful. Golden light painted the walls in warm hues, creating a cocoon of tranquility around them. Beckett lifted his hand, the movement more confident now after months of therapy. His fingers trembled slightly as they found Lucia's, intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both natural and profound. Tears glimmered in Lucia's eyes as she watched their fingers lock together. "Nunca necesitaste caminar para estar de pie," she whispered, her voice full of tenderness. Beckett's smile was radiant as he looked up at her, his heart full of gratitude and love. The setting sun bathed them in its golden light, marking the end of one journey and the beginning of another. If you enjoyed the story of Beckett, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. If you enjoyed the story of Beckett, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.